In this video, I'm going to walk through the solution to question number 1 on the genetics problem set. So in the lead up to this question, we're told that you're carrying out a cross of 2 strains of peas that are true breeding for the flower position trait. Parental strain 1 has terminal flowers, which are at the end of the stem, and parent strain 2 has axial flowers, which are positioned away from the end of the stem. When these 2 parent strains are crossed, the F1 offspring of this cross all have axial flowers. So in other words, flowers positioned away from the stem. So we have to use the information that we're given and answer questions A through E. So question A is asking us which flower position trait is dominant and which is recessive. So how do we know which trait is dominant and which is recessive? Well, we're going to look to the F1 offspring for that information, right? Both of these parent strains are what are called true breeding, which means that if we self-cross either one to itself, it's always going to be breeding true for whatever characteristic is under investigation here. So in other words, parent strain 1, if selfed with itself, is only going to produce flowers that are terminal, right? And when we cross those 2 breeding strains, which are both only able to convey one characteristic with one another, and we create a hybrid, which has to have a genetic contribution from both, then in the hybrid, this F1 generation, we can see what happens when both of those genetic traits are present in the same individuals, right? And the trait that we end up seeing in those hybrid offspring is the one that's dominant. So in this case, the F1 offspring, we're told, all have axial flowers, which means that axial is dominant. So the phenotype, the physical expression of the trait that we see in the F1 offspring gives us information about the dominance interaction between the 2 characteristics, in this case flower position, right? So our dominant trait is the axially positioned flowers, and the recessive trait is the terminal positioned flowers. Question B tells us to use the letter A to symbolize this gene in the convention of a capital letter assigned to the dominant allele. So capital goes to the dominant, and a lowercase letter goes to the recessive allele, and we're to assign genotypes to the parental plants and to the F1 offspring. So genotypes means what alleles are present, what gene alleles are present that are causing this particular phenotype or physical expression of this trait. So we're going to start with the parental plants, parent strain 1 and parent strain 2. Now, important information that we're given in this question is that both of the parental strains of peas are true breeding. So as I mentioned before, if they're true breeding, that means that if we self these plants, we breed the plant with itself, they can only produce offspring that have the same characteristic. We have to cross them with other plants in order to see different traits. Now, because of that, that means that they must only have one kind of gene allele to pass on. If they always produce offspring that have the same characteristics as themselves when we self them, then they must be only containing one type of gene allele. So true breeding means they only have one type of allele to pass on, and that state where all of the alleles are the same type, we call being homozygous, right? The state of having alleles, an allele combination that is the same, we call being homozygous, all right? So we know that both parental strains, parent strain 1 and parent strain 2, are both going to be homozygous, but they could be homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. So in other words, containing both alleles are the dominant allele, or containing both alleles the recessive allele. So we have to look to the phenotypes to tell us whether they are homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. So parent strain 1, we said, has terminal flowers, right? And parent strain 2 has axial flowers? Well, in answer number A, we determined the dominance pattern, and we said that axial is actually the dominant trait. So in this case, parent strain 2 is showing the dominant trait. So parent strain 2 is going to have 2 capital letter symbols for the alleles for this gene. Parent strain 1 has the terminal flowers, and so it is going to have 2 of the recessive alleles. Now, parent strain 2 and parent strain 1 are being crossed to one another, and since parent strain 1 only has the recessive allele to pass on, parent strain 2 only has the dominant allele to pass on, all of their offspring in that F1 generation are going to have the same genotype, which is one of each. One dominant allele, one recessive allele inherited from each parent. And when we have 2 alleles in the same individual that are different at a given gene, we call that genotype heterozygous as opposed to homozygous. All right, so that's question B, done and dusted. Let's go on to question number 3. What type of gametes can be made with respect to this flower position gene in parent 1, parent 2, and the F1 plant? So we kind of already answered that, but let's go ahead and list them again. Remember that gametes are reproductive cells. So since we're talking about plants here, we're talking about things like pollen. And remember that reproductive cells are haploid. They have half the genetic content of the starting organism that produced those reproductive cells. So the P1 generation was diploid, right? Parent 1 was diploid, had 2 recessive alleles, homozygous recessive, but the gametes produced by that individual are going to be haploid, in this case only containing 1 recessive allele. So parent 1 gametes are going to look like that. If we imagine that to be a little pollen grain. Parent 2 gametes, same logic, are also going to be haploid. Parent 2 only has the dominant allele to pass on. So parent 2's gametes, if this is ova, it's going to be fertilized by that pollen. Parent 2's gametes are all going to look like that with 1 dominant allele. Again, haploid, containing half of the genetic content as the parent organism itself. So that's parent 1 and parent 2. What about our F1s? Well, we already talked about the genotype of the F1s being heterozygous. So the F1 plants being heterozygous means that they have 2 separate alleles that they can pass on. They're either going to be passing on the dominant allele or the recessive allele to their offspring. Their gametes are going to be haploid and either contain that dominant allele or that recessive allele, and in 50-50 proportion, right? So half of their gametes are going to contain 1 allele, half of their gametes are going to contain the other. So what types of gametes can parent 1 produce? Haploid gametes containing only the recessive allele, that's all parent 1 has to pass on. Parent 2 can only pass on the dominant allele in its haploid gametes. And the F1 generation has 2 different types of haploid gametes that can be produced. Gametes containing the dominant allele and gametes containing the recessive allele. So question D now asks, if the F1 plants are intercrossed and produce 1,000 offspring, how many would be expected to have axially positioned flowers versus terminal flowers? So if we're going to intercross the F1 plants, so we have one plant that can produce 2 types of gametes. We can put those types of gametes down one side of a Punnett square. The other plant, being the same genotype, is going to be able to produce exactly the same types of gametes. We can put those gametes down the other side of our box and create a Punnett square to represent all possible offspring type that we could get from this kind of a cross between genetically identical F1 plants. And if we combine these gametes, so this is, on this side, the gametes coming from one parent plant, and on this top of the box, the gametes coming from the other parent plant. And if we combine those in all possible combinations, then the offspring, the next generation, in this case the F2 generation, will have genotypes like so, right? And so we end up with 1 out of 4 of our genetic possibilities having 2 dominant alleles, what we would call homozygous dominant. So 1 out of 4 would be homozygous dominant. 2 out of 4, or 1/2, will be heterozygous, having 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. And then another 1 out of 4 will have 2 recessive alleles. So we would call that homozygous recessive. Right, so we figured out what's the probability of these F1 plants producing every single genotype that's possible between parents of those genotypes, heterozygous genotypes. But what this question is actually asking is how many of their offspring out of 1,000 would we expect to have axially positioned flowers versus terminal flowers? So this is asking about phenotype, the physical expression of the trait, not genotype. So we're not done yet, right? So what genotypes in this Punnett square will give us the requested phenotype here? So axially positioned flowers versus terminal flowers. Well, we already figured out that axially positioned flowers is the dominant trait. So any individual who inherits even one of these dominant alleles is going to show the dominant phenotype, in this case axial flowers. And so these 3 out of 4 genotypes are all going to show the dominant trait. So that's these guys. Everybody who's homozygous dominant or heterozygous are going to show axially positioned flowers. So that's 3/4 of the population. And then these guys down here, homozygous recessive, are going to show the recessive trait, which is terminal flowers. 1 out of 4. And so we figured out the proportion that we expect to have axial flowers versus terminal. But remember, this question asked, out of 1,000 offspring, how many would we expect to have axial versus terminal? So if we take this 3/4 proportion, multiply by 1,000 offspring, we would expect 750 offspring to have axial flowers, and then 1/4 times 1,000 will be 250 offspring that we expect to have terminal flowers. And by showing our work here, we have done the second part of this, which is defending our answer by showing our work. Question E asks, if we take our F1s and we cross them back to parental strain 2, which remember was homozygous dominant. So we take our F1 plants, and we're just going to write our genotypes here, our F1 plants, which were heterozygous, and we cross them to parent strain 2, which was homozygous dominant. What proportion of that next generation offspring would we expect to have axially positioned flowers versus terminal flowers? So here we're being asked for a proportion or fraction of that next generation. So again, we can set up a quick little Punnett square. In this case, our Punnett square is actually going to be smaller. Our F1 plants, once again, can pass on either the dominant or the recessive allele. But in this case, our parent 2 strain can only pass on the dominant allele. And so our Punnett square ends up being a very tiny 2×1 Punnett square, right? Since parent 2 only has one allele type that can be passed on. So parent 2's gametes are up here at the top, and the F1 gametes possible are down here on the left-hand side. Again, we're going to combine those gametes in all possible combinations, and we end up with half of our offspring, putative offspring, having a genotype of being homozygous dominant, and half of our offspring having a genotype of being heterozygous. So those are our genotypes. Genotypes, the combination of alleles, what gene alleles are present. But this question is asking about phenotype. Once again, phenotype. So we need to think about, well, if you're homozygous dominant, what phenotype, what physical expression would that genotype give? And likewise for heterozygous, what phenotype would we get? And in both cases, because axially positioned flowers is the dominant trait, and any of these individuals would inherit a dominant allele, 100% of the offspring of this backcross are going to have axially positioned flowers. So even though we have two different genotypes possible in that next generation, we actually have one phenotype possible in that next generation. So 100% of the offspring are expected to have axial flowers. 0% would be expected to have terminal flowers. And you could give that as a percentage or a fraction, whatever works best for you.